Hello, and welcome back to Naptolect, where you can learn as you drift off into a world of knowledge. Tonight we take you through a journey of history with the development of paper and ink. There is something quietly extraordinary about the surfaces on which human beings have chosen to write. Long before paper found its way into the world, before the printing press, before the neat bound book became an everyday object, people were already reaching for something to hold their words. Something that could carry meaning from one mind to another, across a room, across a generation, across centuries. The story of writing surfaces is not a sudden one. It does not arrive in a rush. It unfolds slowly, the way all important things tend to, through small decisions, patient labor, and a gradual understanding of what it truly means to preserve a thought. The long transition from papyrus to parchment to vellum reflects not just the progress of technology, but something deeper. Changing ideas about permanence, about prestige, and about the value of the written word itself. Each material that rose to prominence did so because people believed, in that time and place, that it was worthy of the things they needed to say. It is worth pausing to imagine what these materials actually felt like in the hands of the people who used them every day. Fresh papyrus would have felt fibrous and slightly springy beneath the fingertips. There would have been a kind of faint vegetal dryness to it. The feeling of something that had recently been alive and was now quietly settling into a different kind of permanence. Parchment, by contrast, often carried a soft, faintly leathery scent, the smell of a room that had been left quietly to age, undisturbed, filled with a particular stillness of things that are meant to last. And vellum, the finest of all, could feel almost creamy to the touch. There was a polished smoothness to it that slowed you down, that invited a more careful, more deliberate way of handling it, as though the material itself was asking you to pay attention. The whole process behind these materials carries a hushed atmosphere. Scraping, stretching, drying, mixing, writing, each step patient, deliberate, and almost meditative. There is something in that slowness that is easy to admire from a distance, and perhaps even to miss a little, in a world where words now travel in an instant and vanish just as quickly. We begin at the beginning, or at least, at the beginning of this particular story. Long before parchment, long before vellum, the ancient Mediterranean world found its writing surface growing quietly along the banks of a river. Papyrus was the earlier of the great writing surfaces in that part of the world. It came from a tall, triangular-stemmed plant that grew in dense stands along the Nile, pushing up out of the shallow water in thick green clusters. For the people of ancient Egypt, this plant was not merely useful. It was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that went far beyond writing. But it was as a writing surface that papyrus would leave its most enduring mark on history. The process of making papyrus was careful and considered. The inner pith of the plant stem, a soft, white, spongy material, was cut into long thin strips. These strips were then laid out in two crossing layers and pressed firmly together, their natural moisture and the plant's own sugars acting as a kind of adhesive. The resulting sheet was left to dry, and then polished to a smooth, workable surface. What emerged was something at once surprisingly durable and quietly beautiful, a material that held ink well and could be rolled, stored, and carried with relative ease. One of the most distinctive features of a papyrus sheet, if you were to hold one up to the light, was its texture. The fibers running in those two crossing layers gave the surface a characteristic striped appearance, a fine grid of lines just visible beneath the surface, like the memory of the plant that had made it. This was not a flaw. It was simply the nature of the material, as honest and unadorned as the labor that had produced it. When papyrus sheets needed to carry more text than a single page could hold, they were joined edge to edge, pressed and overlapped along their margins to form a continuous surface. These long-joined sheets could then be rolled up carefully from one end, forming the scroll that became one of the defining objects of the ancient world. Reading a scroll was a physical act, a gradual unrolling, a steady progression through the text, each column of writing revealed in turn and then rolled away behind you. It was a different relationship with the written word than the one we know now, more linear, more deliberate, more present. Papyrus was, in many ways, ideally suited to the world it came from. In dry climates, and particularly in Egypt, where the air along the Nile could be extraordinarily dry away from the river's banks, papyrus could survive for an astonishing length of time. This is one of the reasons so many of the papyrus documents that have come down to us are Egyptian in origin. The desert preserved what wetter climates would have dissolved long ago: letters, contracts, religious texts, lists of goods, scraps of poetry, all of it lying quietly in the earth, waiting to be found. There is something almost melancholy about that thought. That survival was not planned. No one buried those documents intending for them to last 2,000 years. They lasted simply because the air was dry and the sand was deep, and time, for once, was gentle. All that patient writing, all those careful hands pressing strips of pith together in the Egyptian heat, and the words are still here. Here is your second segment. For all its quiet elegance, papyrus was not without its vulnerabilities. There was a softness to it, a suppleness that made it pleasant to handle and well suited to the flowing movements of a reed pen, but that same quality carried a fragility within it. Papyrus could be folded, bent, and rolled without immediately falling apart, but it did not welcome repetition. Fold the same place twice, 3 times, many times over the years, and the fibers would begin to weaken and split. Skin-based materials, which came later, could endure a great deal more of this kind of handling. They had, after all, once wrapped living creatures, and they retained something of that resilience long after they had been prepared for writing. Papyrus had no such inheritance. It was a plant, and it aged the way plants do, slowly and then all at once. This fragility was felt most acutely at a particular point in the papyrus sheet's construction. Where separate sections had been joined together, pressed and overlapped along their edges to create longer rolls, those joints were always the weakest part. Over time, with use and handling and the subtle shifts of temperature and humidity, the joins would begin to loosen. The surface at those seams was never quite as smooth, never quite as reliable as the rest of the sheet. A scribe working near a join would feel it, a slight unevenness, a gentle resistance, and would know that this was a place to be careful. The scroll might survive for years, even decades, but those joints told the truth about the material's limits, and eventually, the limits would make themselves known. It is tempting, when we look back at history, to imagine change as a clean and decisive thing, a moment when one era ends and another begins, marked by some clear turning point that everyone present could recognize. The reality, of course, is almost never like that. Change, especially in the deep rhythms of daily life and craft, tends to arrive the way seasons do. Gradually, overlapping, one thing fading as another slowly brightens. The shift away from papyrus was not sudden. 4 centuries, long, unhurried centuries, older and newer materials existed side by side, used in different places for different purposes by different people. A scribe in one city might still be reaching for a roll of papyrus while a monastery in another region had already made the quiet transition to something else. Trade routes, local availability, the habits of institutions, the preferences of patrons, all of these things shaped the pace of change in ways that no single date can capture. History offers us moments for the sake of understanding, but the people who lived through those moments rarely felt them as moments at all. What we can say is that by around the year 400 of the Common Era, something had shifted in significant portions of West Asia and Europe. For written works intended to last, documents of religion, law, scholarship, and administration, parchment had, in many places, become the preferred surface. It had not conquered everywhere at once, and papyrus would continue to be used in certain regions and for certain purposes for centuries still to come. But the center of gravity had moved. The long, slow tilting of the balance was well underway. The reasons for this were practical and patient, and in the end, simply overwhelming. Parchment was more durable than papyrus in the kinds of climates found across much of Europe and Western Asia, where the air held more moisture and the summers were less reliably dry. Papyrus, so well preserved in the desert, was far more vulnerable to damp. It could absorb moisture, soften, and decay in ways that parchment resisted. For a document meant to survive, meant to be consulted again and again over generations, this was not a small consideration. It was, quietly and over time, a decisive one. There was another practical advantage that made parchment increasingly attractive for the kinds of records and texts that needed to endure. Papyrus could be written on both sides, but not always reliably. The two crossing layers of fiber meant that one side tended to be smoother and more receptive to ink than the other, and writing on the rougher reverse was always a slightly more uncertain affair. Parchment, carefully prepared, offered a much more even surface on both sides. You could write on the front and the back with equal confidence, and this seemingly simple fact had consequences that rippled quietly outward into the whole way written material was organized and stored. Those consequences found their fullest expression in one of the most significant transitions in the entire history of the written word. For as long as papyrus had dominated, the scroll had dominated with it. The two were well matched. Papyrus, cut and joined into long sheets, rolled naturally into the form that suited it. But parchment, stiffer, more durable, workable on both sides, lent itself to something different. You could cut parchment sheets to a consistent size, fold them, stack them, and bind them along one edge. You could, in other words, make a book. The codex, the bound book form, had existed in rudimentary versions even before parchment became widespread, but it was the adoption of parchment as the dominant writing surface that allowed it to fully come into its own. A codex could hold far more text in the same physical space than a scroll of equivalent length. It could be opened to any point without unrolling the whole thing. It could be shelved upright, stacked, carried more easily under an arm. It was, in almost every practical sense, a more efficient and more accessible object than the scroll, and once that became apparent, the codex spread with the quiet inevitability of all genuinely better ideas. The scroll did not vanish overnight. It continued to carry meaning, particularly in religious and ceremonial contexts where tradition held firm and the old form was itself part of the message. But the codex was the future, and parchment had made it possible. In the shift from one writing surface to another, a new way of holding knowledge had been quietly invented. And so we arrive at the material itself, at the question of how parchment was actually made. It is a process worth dwelling on, because it asks something of the imagination. We are so accustomed, now, to paper as the ordinary and almost invisible carrier of written words that it takes a small effort to truly picture the world in which the surface you wrote upon had, not so very long ago, been alive. Parchment is made from animal skin, most commonly from sheep, from goats, or from calves. The choice of animal mattered, though perhaps not always in the ways you might expect. It was not simply about which animal was most available, though availability certainly played a role. Different skins had different qualities. The thickness of the hide, the fineness of the grain, the way the surface would take ink once everything was done. Calfskin, in particular, was prized. It tended to be thinner, finer, smoother, more receptive. In time, the very finest calfskin parchment would come to be called vellum, and it would carry a prestige all of its own. But we will come to that. The preparation of parchment began with soaking. The fresh skin, already separated from the animal and cleaned of the worst of its raw material, was submerged in a bath of water, often with lime added, and left to steep. The lime loosened the structure of the skin, softening the fibers, making the hair easier to remove and the deeper layers more workable. This was not a brief or pleasant process. It took days. The vats in which skins were soaked were a fixture of the medieval craftsman's quarter, and they carried a smell that was frank and unmistakable. The work of making a beautiful thing often begins in conditions that are anything but. Once the soaking had done its work, the skin was removed and the hair was addressed. This was careful, deliberate labor, the parchment maker working with a blunt-edged scraping tool across the wet surface of the skin, removing the hair and the outermost layers with steady, practiced strokes. Too much pressure and the skin could be torn or thinned unevenly. Too little and the surface would not be clean. It required the kind of attentiveness that comes only with long practice, the kind of skill that lives in the hands more than in the mind. With the hair removed, the skin was stretched. This was perhaps the most critical step of all. The wet skin was laced or pegged to a wooden frame, pulled taut in all directions, held under tension as it dried. As the moisture left the skin, it would shrink, and the frame held it against that shrinking, keeping it flat and even. The craftsman would return to the stretched skin periodically as it dried, scraping it again with careful attention, refining the surface, thinning it to the right degree of translucency. The drying could take a day or more depending on the weather, the thickness of the skin, the temperature of the air. You could not rush it. The skin dried in its own time, and the parchment maker worked with that time rather than against it. What emerged from the frame, once the skin was fully dry and the final scraping was done, was something that bore almost no resemblance to the raw material from which it had come. It was pale, often nearly white, or with a warm creamy tone, and smooth and taut, with a surface that would receive ink cleanly and hold it permanently. It had been transformed, through patience and water and careful hands, into something made to last. There is a word that comes to mind when you consider this process: respect. Not sentiment. The work was too physical for sentiment, too bound up in smell and effort and the practical business of livelihood. But a kind of respect for the material, a willingness to work slowly and attend carefully, because the quality of the finished surface depended entirely on the quality of the attention paid to it. The monks and craftspeople who made parchment in great quantities throughout the medieval period understood something that is easy to lose sight of in a world of instant production, that permanence is earned, not assumed. Here is your third segment. There is a distinction worth drawing carefully, because it is one that is easy to overlook and yet speaks to something essential about the nature of parchment as a material. The process of preparing animal skin for writing, the soaking, the scraping, the stretching, the slow drying under tension, was not the same thing as tanning. Leather is tanned, the hide is treated with substances that chemically transform its structure, binding with the proteins of the skin in a way that fundamentally changes what it is. Tanned leather is stable, supple, resistant to moisture, and in a sense finished, converted into something new. Parchment was made differently. The skin was not chemically transformed. It was cleaned and dried and held under tension while it dried, and it was that tension, that careful, sustained stretching, combined with the slow departure of moisture, that gave parchment its character. In a sense, parchment remained closer to what it had always been. It had not been converted so much as it had been persuaded into a new form. And this distinction had consequences, some of them beautiful, and some of them challenging. Because parchment retained more of the essential nature of skin, it remained responsive to the world around it in ways that tanned leather did not. It breathed, in a manner of speaking. It noticed the air. Parchment was never a cheap material. This is worth understanding clearly, because it shapes everything about how it was used and who used it and what was written upon it. To produce a single sheet of parchment required an animal, and labor, and time, none of which were abundantly available in a world where every resource was carefully husbanded, compared to paper, which would eventually arrive and transform everything, and even compared to papyrus, which could be harvested in great quantities from the Nile Delta, parchment was dense and expensive. A large manuscript, a complete Bible, say, or a substantial collection of legal documents, might require the skins of hundreds of animals. The decision to commit to such a project was not taken lightly. It represented a significant investment of resources, and that investment was itself a statement about the importance of what was being recorded. You did not waste parchment on things that did not matter. This density, the physical weight and solidity of well-made parchment, was part of what made it so durable. A parchment leaf had a substance to it that you could feel, a presence in the hand that spoke of the labor that had gone into its making. When you held a parchment manuscript, you were holding something that had cost a great deal to produce, and the material communicated that plainly. What is perhaps less obvious and more quietly remarkable is that the expense and the care involved in making parchment meant that every sheet was also subtly individual. Different parts of the same animal skin could produce slightly different textures. The hide along the spine of a sheep tended to be thicker and more even, while the flanks might yield a surface that was thinner and more variable, and the areas around the legs and neck had their own particular qualities. A skilled parchment maker would know these variations and account for them, selecting the best portions for the finest work. But even in the most carefully prepared manuscript, if you looked closely, and if the light was right, you might notice the page shifting subtly from one leaf to the next, a slightly different warmth of tone, a faintly different weight of surface. And if you looked more closely still, you might see something else, the faint ghost of what the material had once been. A well-made parchment leaf could show tiny pores, or the most subtle suggestion of a grain, not obtrusively, not in a way that interfered with the writing, but quietly, like the memory of skin still present in the page. The hair follicles of the original animal, invisible to a casual glance, remained encoded in the surface for anyone who cared to look. It is one of the stranger and more affecting details in the history of writing materials, that the page, even after all that preparation, remembered. The choice of which side to write on was also a considered one. Every parchment sheet had two sides, what had been the outer surface of the animal, where the hair had grown, and the inner surface, which had faced inward toward the flesh. These two sides were never quite identical. The outer, hair side tended to be slightly smoother after preparation, more uniform, more receptive to ink. The inner side could be a little rougher in texture, a little more prone to absorbing the ink unevenly. Scribes knew the difference and chose accordingly, selecting the smoother side for the primary writing surface, reserving the other for secondary use, or planning the gathering of sheets so that like surfaces faced like when the book was opened, giving the reader a consistent experience as they turned from page to page. This was the kind of quiet, accumulated knowledge that lived in workshops and monasteries, passed from one practitioner to the next, not written down in any manual, simply known. One of the most telling signs of parchment's continued kinship with living skin is something you can observe in very old manuscripts that have survived to the present day. In rooms where the temperature and humidity shift with the seasons, or even with the weather, or the heat of a body leaning close to read, the corners of old parchment leaves will sometimes lift. They curl, very gently, rising from the page below as though testing the air. In dry conditions the parchment tightens and contracts. In damp conditions it relaxes and expands. This is not damage, or at least not necessarily. It is simply the material's nature, its memory of being alive and responsive still present after centuries. Scholars and conservators who work with old manuscripts speak of this quality with a kind of quiet affection. The manuscripts breathe with the room. They respond to the presence of the people who come to read them. There is something in that which feels less like deterioration and more like a kind of conversation across time. This responsiveness, however, also brought a practical advantage that the makers and users of parchment understood very well. Because parchment retained the structure of skin rather than being chemically transformed, its surface could be worked. A mistake, a word written incorrectly, a line that needed to be changed, a passage that a later owner wished to revise or remove, did not have to be permanent. With the careful application of a scraping tool, the ink could be lifted from the surface of the parchment, the fibers of the skin gently abraded until the error was gone and a fresh, clean area was revealed. This was far more readily accomplished on parchment than on papyrus, where the layers of plant fiber were more easily disrupted and where heavy scraping could damage the sheet beyond use. On parchment, a patient hand with a light touch could correct, revise, and restore without leaving more than the faintest shadow of what had been there before. This capacity for correction was not a small thing in a world where writing materials were precious. It meant that a parchment leaf, unlike a papyrus one, did not have to be discarded the moment it contained an error. It could be salvaged, corrected, reused. The surface was not just a carrier of text, it was, in a sense, a reusable resource, and parchment makers and scribes both understood its value in those terms. That understanding led, in time, to one of the most quietly extraordinary phenomena in the history of written culture. Parchment that had already been written upon, a document that had served its purpose, a text that was no longer needed, a manuscript that had fallen out of use, could be scraped clean and written upon again. Sometimes the scraping was thorough, and the previous text was lost almost entirely, leaving only the faintest ghost of ink in the depths of the fibers. Sometimes it was less complete, and the old writing remained visible beneath the new, like a conversation half erased. These reused sheets are known as palimpsests, from the Greek for scraped again, and they became common precisely because parchment was so valuable that the idea of wasting a usable surface was almost unthinkable. For later scholars, palimpsests became something extraordinary. Manuscripts that contained, hidden within themselves, older texts that had been considered dispensable at the time of scraping but which turned out to be among the rarest and most important surviving documents of the ancient world. Works that were thought entirely lost have been recovered from beneath later writing, the original ink still faintly legible to the right eye, or to the technologies that now allow us to see what the naked eye cannot. The economy of a medieval scriptorium, its careful unwillingness to waste a single good sheet of parchment, preserved, entirely by accident, things that might otherwise have vanished from the world forever. Above parchment in the hierarchy of writing surfaces sat something rarer and more refined, a material that took everything parchment offered and pushed it further, into a quality of surface that those who worked with it seemed almost reluctant to describe in purely practical terms. Vellum was, in its simplest definition, a finer and higher quality type of parchment. But the simplest definition does not quite do it justice. Vellum was traditionally made from the skins of young animals. Youth mattered because young skin was thinner, finer, more delicate in its grain, and capable of being prepared to a degree of smoothness that the skin of an older animal simply could not match. A calf was the classic source, hence the word vellum itself, which traces back through Old French to a Latin root connected to the calf. But the skins of young sheep and young goats were also used, and in some traditions the skins of other young animals found their way into the finest manuscripts as well. What they all shared was that fineness of texture, that capacity to be worked down to something almost translucent, almost impossibly smooth, that distinguished true vellum from ordinary parchment. The quality of the finished vellum depended on a constellation of factors that began long before the skin reached the parchment maker's workshop. The age of the animal was important. Very young animals produced the finest skins, and in some of the most prestigious manuscript traditions, the skins of stillborn or unborn calves were sought out for work of particular delicacy. But age alone was not sufficient. The health of the animal mattered too. A well-nourished animal, raised carefully, would produce a skin of more consistent quality and finer grain than one that had been poorly fed or frequently ill. The species mattered, because different animals carried their skin differently, with different thicknesses and different distributions of fat and follicle across the hide. And the particular part of the hide mattered, as we have already seen. The finest areas of an already fine skin yielding the finest surface of all. All of this meant that truly exceptional vellum was rare, and the rarity was built into the material from the very beginning. Before the soaking, before the stretching, before the first touch of the scraping tool. The parchment maker could refine what the animal had provided, but could not create something from nothing. The quality of the raw material set the ceiling, and only the most careful and skilled preparation could bring the finished surface close to it. Here is your fourth segment. To hold a piece of well-made vellum is to understand immediately why it was prized above almost every other writing surface the medieval world produced. There is a quality to it that resists straightforward description. Not quite like paper, not quite like anything else that common experience offers as a comparison. The closest word, and the one that seems to recur in the accounts of those who have handled fine vellum closely, is creamy. There is a softness in the way the surface meets the fingertip. Not rough, not cold, not glassy, but something warmer and more yielding than any of those. A slight give, a subtle depth, as though the surface has a very small amount of quiet generosity built into it. And beneath that softness, a firmness, a sureness, that tells you this is a material that knows what it is for. This quality was not accidental, and it was not easy to achieve. It was the product of every careful decision that had gone into the material's making. The youth of the animal, the patience of the soaking, the steadiness of the hand that scraped, the unhurried discipline of the drying under tension. Vellum that felt the way vellum should feel was the accumulated result of all of that work, compressed into a surface barely thicker than heavy paper. When a scribe reached for a fresh sheet of vellum and felt that smoothness under the palm, they were feeling the labor of everyone who had brought that material to them. Even the finest vellum, however, was not a uniform thing. Look at a well-preserved vellum manuscript under good light, daylight, ideally, falling at a low angle across the page, and you will almost always see variation. The color of vellum is not one single shade. It moves. Across a single leaf, and more noticeably across the gathered leaves of a whole manuscript, the tone shifts from a warm ivory in some areas to a cooler, paler shade that approaches gray in others. These variations follow the original geography of the animal's skin, the thinner areas tending toward translucency and coolness, the denser areas holding a deeper warmth. In some manuscripts, this variation is very slight, a barely perceptible drift of tone that you might notice without being able to name. In others, it is more pronounced, and the pages of the book carry something of the creature that made them, quietly present in the pale irregularity of the surface. For the scribes and artists who worked on these surfaces, this was not merely a visual matter. The surface of parchment and vellum had a tactile character that mattered deeply, perhaps more deeply than we, working on paper and screens, quite have the frame of reference to appreciate. The hand that held the pen was in constant contact with the page, and the quality of that contact shaped everything. The flow of the ink, the pressure required, the way the nib moved across the surface, the rhythm of the work itself. A surface that was too rough would catch the pen and cause the ink to blot or spray. A surface that was too smooth, paradoxically, could cause the pen to skid and the line to lose control. Well-prepared vellum offered something in between, a surface that had just enough tooth to guide the pen without resisting it, just enough smoothness to allow the ink to flow cleanly and settle evenly. Scribes who worked regularly on fine vellum developed a sensitivity to this quality that became part of their craft, as much as their letterforms or their choice of pen. It was this combination of qualities, the paleness, the evenness, the faint creaminess of touch, and the reliable smoothness of surface, that made vellum the natural choice for the most ambitious and most beautiful manuscripts that the medieval world produced. When a patron commissioned a work of genuine prestige, a gospel book for a royal chapel, a psalter for a wealthy noble, an illuminated book of hours for private devotion, vellum was the expected surface. Not merely because it was expensive, though expense was part of the message, but because it was genuinely the best material available for the work that needed to be done. Vellum accepted ink beautifully. The carefully prepared surface held the ink at just the right depth. Not so deep that the color was absorbed and dulled, not so shallow that it sat on top and smeared. The blacks were black, and the colors were colors, and there was a clarity and a precision to the finished line that a rougher surface simply could not match. But it was in combination with gold that vellum perhaps showed most fully what it was capable of. The technique of gilding in manuscripts, applying thin leaf of beaten gold to the page so that it caught the light and seemed to glow from within, required a surface of exceptional smoothness and consistency. On vellum, gold leaf adhered reliably and lay flat and even, reflecting the light with an almost liquid quality that made the pages of the finest illuminated manuscripts look, in certain lights, less like documents and more like objects of another order altogether. The finest illuminators understood what vellum offered and built their work around it. The smoothness that made gilding possible also made fine ruling possible, the careful laying down of guidelines and plummet or hardpoint that would keep the columns of text straight and even, and it made delicate script possible, the kind of small, precise letterforms that carried long texts in compact formats without losing legibility. All of this depended on the surface, and the surface depended on all those hours of patient preparation that had preceded the first touch of a pen or brush. The illuminated manuscript was not merely a written object. It was a collaboration between the skills of the scribe and artist and the qualities of the material they worked on, and vellum was a participant in that collaboration, not merely a backdrop. Not every manuscript was made entirely of vellum, and not every manuscript was made entirely of anything. The practical realities of production in a medieval scriptorium, the variable supply of skins, the fluctuating costs of materials, the different levels of importance assigned to different sections of a text, meant that many books were composite objects, containing different materials within the same binding. A large Bible might begin with the finest vellum for the opening pages and the most prominent texts, then transition gradually to a slightly coarser parchment for the later books, where the perceived need for prestige was lower and the pressure to complete the work within available resources was felt more keenly. A legal document might use the finest available surface for the main text and a rougher one for the appended notes. A manuscript assembled over time, by multiple hands, in more than one period, might tell the story of its own production in the shifting quality of its leaves. This variation was not always a compromise. Sometimes it was a deliberate choice, a reflection of a genuinely considered hierarchy of value that the makers of the book held clearly in mind. The most sacred or most important passages deserved the finest surface. Other passages, no less necessary but carrying less symbolic weight, could be accommodated on something less exceptional. The book as a whole was a coherent object, but within it, the material itself carried meaning, and those who made it and used it knew how to read that meaning as readily as they read the text. It is at this point in our story that we turn from the surface of the page to something equally essential, the substance with which the page was marked. For a writing surface, however beautiful, is only half the conversation. The other half is the ink, and the history of ink is as long and as careful and as quietly remarkable as the history of the materials it was written upon. Among the various inks that have been used across the centuries of European manuscript culture, one stands above the rest in importance, in longevity, and in the quality of the mark it leaves. It is made from oak galls, those small, hard, roundish growths that appear on oak trees in certain seasons, and which are, when you look at them closely, one of the stranger products of the natural world. Oak galls are not a disease of the tree, exactly, though they are caused by something the tree did not choose. They form when certain small insects, most commonly a type of tiny wasp, lay their eggs in the soft growing tissue of an oak, typically in a leaf bud or along a young twig. The tree responds to this intrusion by producing an abnormal growth of tissue around the site, a hardened, rounded structure that encases the developing larva and provides it with shelter and nourishment as it grows. From the tree's perspective, this might be understood as a kind of containment, an attempt to wall off the intruder. From the insect's perspective, it is a home, purpose-built and reliably stocked. From the perspective of those who came later and found a use for these strange little growths, it was something else again, a natural reservoir of one of the most important chemical compounds in the history of ink. The compound in question is tannin. Oak galls are unusually rich in tannins, far richer than the bark or leaves of the oak tree itself, though those too contain the compound in smaller quantities. Tannins are astringent substances, and they have a long history of practical use in human culture. In the curing of leather, in the preservation of food, in medicine. But their role in ink is the one that concerns us here, and to understand it we need to follow the galls from the tree to the workshop, which is where their transformation began. The gathering of oak galls was a seasonal and deliberate activity. The galls were harvested from oak trees, collected by hand, dried, and stored against need. Those gathered before the larva inside had fully matured were considered the best, because the concentration of tannin in the gall was highest at that stage, before the insect had consumed a portion of the material during its development. A gall from which the larva had already emerged and escaped through its small exit hole was a lighter, more hollow thing, still useful, but somewhat less rich. Experienced gatherers knew the difference, and would sort their harvest accordingly, reserving the best for the most important work. The oak gall, then, was not merely incidental to the story of ink. It was its source, or at least the source of the essential ingredient that would give oak gall ink its most important quality, and that quality was permanence. The ink made from these gatherings would prove, over centuries of use, to be among the most durable marking substances ever applied to a writing surface. It would resist fading, resist washing, resist the passage of time in ways that simpler inks could not. It would bond with the parchment and vellum surfaces it was applied to in a way that made separation almost impossible. And it would do all of this quietly, asking nothing of its users except that they know how to make it and how to use it. Knowledge that, once acquired, passed from hand to hand through the long centuries of manuscript culture, as patient and as persistent as the ink itself. Here is your final segment. To understand why oak gall ink became the dominant ink of manuscript culture across so much of the medieval and early modern world, it helps to understand the chemistry at its heart, not in the dry language of a textbook, but as a kind of quiet alchemy that those who made and used the ink were not always able to explain, yet understood in practice with great precision. The essential reaction is between tannins and iron. The tannins extracted from oak galls, dissolved in water, would on their own produce a liquid of some color. A pale brownish fluid, useful but not remarkable. The transformation came with the addition of iron salts, most commonly in the form of vitriol, a crystalline iron compound that could be dissolved and added to the tannin solution to produce something quite different. When tannin and iron met in solution, they reacted. The iron bound to the tannin molecules, forming new chemical compounds, iron tannates, that were darker, more stable, and far more tenacious than either ingredient alone. This binding was not merely a surface effect. When iron gall ink was applied to parchment or vellum, The iron tannate compounds did not simply sit on top of the material the way a thin wash of pigment might. They penetrated. They moved into the fibers of the skin, bonding with the collagen of the parchment at a molecular level, becoming in a very real sense part of the material, rather than a coating applied to it. To remove iron gall ink from a parchment surface was not simply a matter of washing or scraping away a layer. The ink had entered the page, had made itself at home there, and separating the two was a far more involved and uncertain process. This penetration was understood by scribes as a quality of the best inks, and it was one of the central reasons that iron gall ink was so valued for work intended to last. An ink that sat on the surface could be disturbed. An ink that had entered the material was as permanent as the material itself. There was another quality that made iron gall ink the natural companion for the pale, carefully prepared surfaces of parchment and vellum, and that was the darkness of the mark it made. Contrast matters in writing, not merely for aesthetic reasons, but for the most practical one of all, which is legibility. A text that cannot be clearly read has failed at its most fundamental purpose, regardless of how beautiful the hand that wrote it or how fine the surface it was written upon. Iron gall ink produced a strong, clear, dark mark on the light-colored surfaces of parchment and vellum, the black or deep blue-black of the dried ink standing cleanly against the pale warmth of the prepared skin. In a manuscript lit by candlelight or the gray light of a northern window, that contrast was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and iron gall ink provided it reliably. But the darkness of iron gall ink was not an immediate thing. This is one of the details about the ink that is easy to overlook and yet worth understanding, because it illuminates something about the experience of the scribe who used it every day. When first mixed and first applied to a pen, iron gall ink begins its life as a brownish fluid, not black, not deeply dark, but something closer to the color of weak tea or the diluted extract of something organic and unfinished. It is, at that stage, a working liquid, and the color it carries is the color of potential rather than completion. As the ink meets the air, as oxidation begins, the color deepens. The iron tannate compounds, reacting with oxygen, shift toward darkness. The brown becomes a gray, the gray deepens toward blue, the blue darkens toward black. By the time the written page has dried and been left for any length of time, what was written in a tentative brownish fluid has become a deep, rich blue-black, a color with a depth and a steadiness that simpler inks could rarely match. The page, in other words, finishes what the scribe began. The writing continues to develop after the pen has lifted, the chemistry proceeding quietly in the fibers of the parchment, the color settling into its final form over hours and days. When the ink was freshly laid down, before the oxidation had fully done its work, it could look glossy and wet, almost liquid still, catching the light with a slight sheen as though reluctant to let it go. Then, as it dried, that surface gloss would recede, and what remained was something quieter and richer, a velvety darkness that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, deep and matte and final. The act of writing with oak gall ink on fine vellum had a physical character that scribes would have known intimately, in the way that you know the feel of any tool you use every day until it becomes an extension of your own hand. The pen, a quill, in the manuscript tradition, cut from the flight feather of a goose or swan, would be charged with ink and brought to the surface of the vellum, and as it made contact and began to move, there was often a brief, dry scratch at the start of the stroke, the slight resistance of the surface against the point of the quill before the ink began to flow. Then the flow would come, and with it a slow pooling of darkness in each stroke, not an instant uniform blackness, but a slight gathering of ink at the edges of the line, a depth that built as the pen moved and the ink followed. Experienced scribes managed this quality with their pressure and their speed, knowing when to let the ink pool slightly for emphasis and when to move quickly for a finer, more uniform line. On vellum especially, there was a quality to the ink's behavior in those first moments of contact that scribes and artists who have worked with historical materials sometimes describe with something close to wonder. The ink could seem to float on the surface for a brief instant before it sank, hovering at the boundary between the liquid and the material, as though pausing before committing, and then it would settle, moving into the fine texture of the vellum, finding its place in the prepared skin. In that small, imperceptible moment, the two materials, the prepared surface and the carefully made ink, were meeting for the first time, beginning the bond that, in a well-made manuscript, would prove strong enough to survive centuries. There was a rhythm to all of this that sustained a long working day. The loading of the pen, the testing of the flow, the movement across the ruled lines of the page, the occasional pausing to recut the quill when the point had worn and the line had begun to spread. All of it falling into a steady, unhurried pattern that the body learned and eventually carried without deliberate thought. Writing a manuscript was not merely an intellectual act. It was a physical one, and the materials were participants in it, shaping the rhythm and the quality of the work as surely as the skill of the scribe. And yet, for all its virtues, iron gall ink carried within itself a complication, a consequence of the same chemistry that made it so permanent and so dark. The reaction between tannin and iron that produced the ink's strength also produced acidity, and acidity, over time, is the enemy of the materials it inhabits. A well-formulated iron gall ink, made with care and used on good parchment, might sit in perfect stability for 500 years, 1,000 years, the writing as dark and clear as the day it was set down. But a badly made ink, one in which the proportions were wrong, or the vitriol was impure, or the acidity was not balanced by the addition of gum arabic or other moderating substances, could, over time, begin to work against the very surface it had been applied to. The acid in the ink, rather than settling into quiet equilibrium with the parchment or paper beneath it, would continue its chemical activity, slowly degrading the fibers of the page around each stroke of writing. The result, in the most severely affected manuscripts, is unmistakable and quietly devastating. The written lines become brittle. The parchment or paper at the edge of each letter loses its flexibility, its integrity, until eventually the writing can be seen not as marks on a surface but as lines of damage through it, the ink having consumed the material it was meant to serve. In some manuscripts, the text has literally fallen away in fragments, leaving only the ghost of each letter in the holes where the ink once sat. In others, the damage is less complete but still visible, a faint browning of the parchment around each line of writing, a slight crispness at the edges of strokes, a halo of chemical change spreading outward from the ink into the surrounding surface, the mark of a reaction that was given more freedom than was good for the page. This halo, the faint burn or darkening around the letters, is one of the more poignant details in the history of writing materials. The scribe who made those marks intended permanence. They used the best ink available, the most chemically robust and the most durable of all the inks their world produced. And the ink was, in a sense, too powerful, so committed to its own permanence that it could not stop at the boundary of the letter, but continued outward, slowly, into the page that had received it. Permanence, pursued without perfect balance, became its own kind of damage. This is not a condemnation of iron gall ink, which served the written word faithfully for well over 1,000 years and preserved more of human knowledge and expression than any other single marking substance in history. It is simply an acknowledgement that even the best of materials, made with the best of intentions, exist within the limits of chemistry and time, and that those limits are not always visible at the moment of making. Iron gall ink continued to darken as the centuries passed, the oxidation proceeding slowly, steadily, deepening the blue-black of the dried writing into something that could approach, in the finest manuscripts, an almost luminous intensity. The darkness of old iron gall script, seen under good light on a pale vellum page, has a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not encountered it directly. It is not merely the color of the ink. It is the accumulated depth of the reaction, the compressed chemistry of 1,000 years of quiet change, giving the writing a presence and a weight that goes beyond what any freshly applied ink quite achieves. The manuscripts that survive from the great centers of medieval book production are not merely historical documents. They are, in a very real sense, objects that have continued to develop, quietly and without human intervention, long after the hands that made them were gone. And so we arrive, at last, at the end of this particular story, though end is perhaps the wrong word for something that simply fades slowly into the wider history of paper and print and all the transformations that followed. What the story of papyrus and parchment and vellum and ink offers, if we sit with it quietly, is a kind of material logic, a logic that is not dramatic but is deeply satisfying, in the way that any long process of refinement is satisfying when you can see it whole. The rough, fibrous surface of papyrus, which served so well for so long in the dry heat of the Nile Valley, gave way gradually and then more completely to skin-based surfaces that could be smoother, tougher, more archival, more responsive to the climates and the ambitions of the cultures that adopted them. Parchment offered durability and a surface that could be worked and corrected and reused. Vellum refined those qualities into something that approached, at its finest, a kind of perfection, a surface so well suited to the finest writing and the most ambitious decoration that it remained the prestige material of the written word for centuries after cheaper alternatives became available. And through all of this, oak gall ink brought to each of these surfaces its deep, steady, penetrating darkness, a mark that did not merely rest on the page but became part of it, clinging to the fibers of prepared skin with a tenacity that the centuries have proved and proved again. There is something quietly worth contemplating in the patience of all of this. The gathering of galls from oak trees in the early summer. The soaking of skins in lime baths over many days. The slow drying of stretched parchment in the open air. The darkening of freshly written words over hours and days as the iron and the tannin continued their unhurried reaction. None of it was fast. None of it was meant to be. The people who did this work, the parchment makers and ink makers and scribes and illuminators, lived in a different relationship with time than the one we inhabit now, and their materials reflected that relationship and reinforced it. To make something permanent, you had to be willing to be slow. To write something that would last, you had to work with materials that had their own pace, their own chemistry, their own quiet logic, and you had to learn to follow rather than to hurry. The manuscripts that survive from those centuries are not merely containers of the words written on them. They are records of that patience, physical evidence of a long, deliberate, collaborative process in which the material and the maker worked together toward something that neither could have achieved alone. When you see one in a library or a museum, held carefully in its archival box, the vellum still slightly cream in the right light, the iron gall script still dark against the pale page, what you are seeing is the result of all of that unhurried work, still present, still legible, still carrying its words across the centuries with a steadiness that has nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with care. That, perhaps, is the deepest thing this story has to offer. Not just information about materials and chemistry and craft, but a reminder that some of the things we most value, clarity, permanence, beauty, the faithful transmission of meaning across time, are the products not of speed or force, but of patient attention to the nature of things, of knowing your materials, of working with them slowly, and well, and with respect for what they are and what they can do, of understanding that the best mark is not always the fastest one, but the one that has been given time to settle, to bond, to become, quietly and without fuss, a part of the surface that receives it.